if we really want to go that way.
All right, a difficult task is difficult economically, and Efthymios ARAVANTINOS. It could be difficult politically if you ask Greece to start selling. Some are even openly talking, as you just heard, about selling islands, about selling sites that are culturally sensitive. What's your reaction when you hear that?
Well, we're not talking about selling islands in any case. And that's a bit undermining a bit Greek people as well as Greece in general. But I agree with the gentleman that, of course, it is difficult to sell assets. It's not an easy task, but I'm quite confident that the plan organized by the government is a very detailed and a plan which is well organized in time.
But you just heard they're supposed to come up with at least 50 billion, and they're at least 35 short.
That's what the gentleman says. Perhaps
those are his estimates.
Those are his estimates.
Not necessarily.
But I mean, you don't expect me to trust more his estimates than the government estimates. I'm sorry about that.
I totally agree with you. One thing the gentleman on the phone didn't mention is the fact that once you privatize, you reduce government employment, and you create, not only government does not have to pay these people, government will start collecting taxes from the private producers. So in government expenditures go down and government revenue increases.
And another thing is, I mean, how did he evaluate prices?
All right, Bernardo Bartolotti, a lot of questions there. When you talk about the shortfall, is that simply on the sale, or is that taking into account the value that'll be generated from those sales?
Well, the metric that we use are very simple. So the first one, which allows us to get to the value of the listed stake, is simply given by the value of the actual residual stake of the government in listed companies. And from our calculation, as of yesterday, the government owned in a range of 6.5 billion euro. And these are the part with the most easy part to sell. So eventually, if the government would like to divest the entire stake and package in listed firm, obviously you should consider also the control premium, but you can expect something in the range from 6 to 8 billions. With the rest, we have been able to find a list of around 70 not listed firms with assets which are worth something like 7 billions. So in the most optimistic scenario that these companies are not leveraged, you may end up with an additional, let's say, 8. We have no clue about the possible valuation measure for the rest of the assets. I tried to get some information from some detailed information, but still wasn't able to find it. But still, it seems that the 50 billion price tag is definitely a very
it's well short of that.
Is the Greek government misinforming the world community, the European Union? That's pretty hard to believe.
Accept.
These are official numbers they have given to their European partners.
They have been communicated to the European partners.
Exactly.
Bernardo Bartolotti?
Yes. These are the official numbers which have been negotiated. But do you have a published list of deals which involve non-listed and outside of the spectrum of listed and unlisted companies to publish, to disclose to the international financial community? I didn't find it. If you just could send it to me, I would be delighted to have a more proper evaluation of what is left to get to the 50.
All right. In any case, there is growing...
Might I intervene at this point?
Sure. Yeah. Let's hear from Yanis VAROUFAKIS in Athens.
Yes. Apologies for butting in. It's just that I'm tempted. 2 points. Firstly, I agree entirely that with my colleague from Italy that 50 billion is pie in the sky. It's a science fiction scenario. There is a classic mistake that a first-year student of economics would have been failed for making the mistake of confusing a marginal price with an average price. But let's not dwell on this.
You're above my head.
There's no way that they will get 50.
There is no margin.
They will get, if they get 15 billion from these asset sales, they should be counting themselves to be extremely lucky. But the most important thing is not that. Let's assume that they manage to get 50 billion from those sales in the next 4 years. So in my simulations, macro simulations, I've assumed that they managed to get 15 billion this year, 15 billion next year, and 10 billion in the next 2 years, each of 2 years. Do you know what the effect of that will be, even if all this is used in order to buy back in the secondary market at a discount Greek government bonds? What the effect of that will be on the path of the Greek debt to GDP ratio? This is what it's going to be. By 2016, that ratio will have exceeded 200%.
We're at 150 now.
Remain outside the markets, and the surplus countries, Germany in particular, would no longer be able to convince the electorate to carry on financing this extraordinary and exorbitant plan of throwing good money after bad in the case of the Greek state. So the default is going to happen. It's going to happen at a much larger scale soon, well, in the next year or two. And by that time, the political deficit, both in the surplus countries and in the deficit countries, will be such that we will not be able to pass through our parliaments and to convince our electorates that steps will need to be taken to save the eurozone.
All right, so better. In other words, you're saying, Yanis Varoufakis, you're saying better sooner than later for a default of Greece for leaving the eurozone.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the way we're going, we won't be able to avoid it, and it will be a catastrophe for everyone. I'm not in favor of a default. What I'm in favor of is a rational, systemic solution to a systemic crisis, which is percolating throughout the banking sector from Germany to Portugal and from Ireland to Greece. It's a crisis of the banking sector that we're refusing to focus on, instead focusing on the Greek debt, which is relatively insignificant compared to the problem of the banking sector of the eurozone. And when it comes to the debt, well, you can't talk about the restructuring of the Greek debt without the restructuring of the Irish debt, or doing something about the Spanish debt, or even the Italian debt. This is a European crisis, and we have to deal with it as if it were, and because it is, a systemic crisis of the euro. This extreme, and one side is focused on the Greek situation, is simply giving us an opportunity, never to miss an opportunity to do something about the euro crisis that we're facing.
All right.
May I react? May I react to this?
Very briefly, Bernardo Bartolotti.
Yes, of course. Just to say that I'm totally sympathetic with the observation made. The package and it seems to follow very much in the sort of European version of Washington consensus style of structural reform, which should be reconsidered very soon, with additional new measure with more perspective and context. That's it.
Let me react to this. I think you guys are approaching it from an ideological point of view rather than from a practical point of view. This is a Greek problem, and you're expecting the rest of the world, the rest of Europe, to pay for it without affecting anything in Greece. I think that's very unrealistic. The problem started with Greece, and I think the solution has to start first in Greece and then in other countries.
Excuse me, sir, but what is so illogical about saying that when you have a bankruptcy problem, you do not solve it by means of expensive loans and austerity that reduces the GDP from which those loans will be repaid? Where is the ideology involved in that?
When you talk about the Washington consensus, has nothing to do with this.
I didn't mention the Washington consensus. I
don't know who is on the other side. I just hear it on this side.
All right.
It's me. Isn't that the approach that the package has been unfolded is exactly the sort of conditionality mechanism. You restructure, you implement fiscal austerity, we give you the loan. That's Washington consensus.
Well, let's make this just a little bit more concrete, because many of us are not following what the Washington consensus is. But we'll just to pick up on one point that Yanis Varoufakis made, that Greek citizens not the only ones who are thoroughly fed up with their politicians, and it's pretty easy to see why. We've talked about the indignados in Spain. You can see why when you look at the unemployment numbers from across the continent, And the unemployment numbers that you see of certain select countries, the EU average, 9.4% on that graph, 6.1% in Germany, and look at Spain, 20.7%. And you can look at the front page, if you will, of this Wednesday's Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph, which headlines, that's the Financial Times, there we are, strikers threaten holiday chaos. Now, the strikers they're talking about, though, are not Greek. The strikers they're talking about are in the UK. Britain on the eve of a massive public sector strike against its own belt-tightening plan. This, the boomerang effect of massive debt incurred after stimulus spending. The issue coming to a head this Wednesday during Parliament's Ministers' Question Time.
What people are asking up and down this country is, what is he doing to our NHS?
What the whole country will have noticed is at a time when people are worried about strikes, he can't ask about strikes because he's in the pocket of the unions. What the whole country will have noticed is at a time when Greece is facing huge problems over its deficit, he can't talk about Greece because his plan is to make Britain like Greece.
And there again, Efthymios ARAVANTINOS. We conclude with Greece's good name being used not in a favourable light. What's your reaction when you see those images?
Well, we have been in focus for several months now, but previous speakers have not talked. You spoke about Europe. They haven't placed Europe in the context. I would say that we are in quite a dynamic situation, and so far Europe has responded quite well. Of course, it's not as fast as the market, but it did respond. So it did.
And more response will be needed now.
It did show, a huge solidarity towards Greece and in concerning all European debt crisis. So
Greece not being left out on lurch. We're going to have to leave it there because we're running out of time. But I want to thank you, Efthymios ARAVANTINOS, for joining us. I want to thank Ali Fatemi and for joining us from Turin, Bernardo Bartolotti, and from Athens, Yanis Varoufakis. And thank you for being with us for the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's Business with Marcus Carlson.